Welcome to the second day of our annual Foreign Policy Conference of the Rising Asia Foundation and the Rising Asia Journal. Yesterday, we had the singular pleasure of listening to the distinguished annual Foreign Policy Lecture by Ambassador Dr. Dino Pati Jalal, who is the chairman and the founder of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, a former Vice Minister of Indonesia, a presidential advisor in the past, and a very well-published author in Indonesia and abroad. In his lecture, Ambassador Dr. Dino laid out the paradoxes that confront the Asian century. And, these are the paradoxes he talked about, which are proving to be stumbling blocks to a cohesive and a predictable trajectory to the unfurling and unfolding of the century. So he has also, in his talk, located the position of Indonesia in the matrix of the overall Southeast Asian region and beyond, considering that it is the largest power in the ASEAN countries. Among his observations is the obvious one that this whole business of trying to contain China is a lost cause, because China is beyond containment. China can't be contained, and therefore an Asian century would incorporate as a major participant the People's Republic of China and its contributions to the Asian century. And then he looked at also, one of his important observations was that there's a need for a regional consensus on the basis of which ASEAN works, which should be a consensus within South Asia. So South Asia, he recommends, it needs to have a more regional approach. And the same thing for Northeast Asia, which is divided between the Koreas, and Central Asia, which also has no real cohesion among itself. Now, if these other regions were to cohere, and if they developed a sort of consensus on a regional basis, the formation of an Asian century might then truly be an Asian event. But this, of course, may not be achievable in the small time frame up to 2050. Beyond that, we don't know. Ambassador Dr. Dino pointed out that how Indonesia had started the confrontasi against Malaysia and Singapore and Brunei, and how it ended confrontasi. And the fact that there was a willingness and political events helped the Indonesian internal politics to evolve in such a way that confrontasi ended, and the confrontation, which was violent between Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, which resulted in Indonesian launched communist aggression against these two other countries. How well that ended, and whether this serves as a sort of, in some form, a lesson for other countries. Now, the problems of the other parts of the region, South Asia and the Northeast Asian countries, the Korean Peninsula, are far more entrenched and much more complex than what confrontasi ever was. But the ASEAN members can only speak from their own experience, and which has been relatively trouble-free. And this is something for all of us to learn from. And so with that, I welcome our speakers, Dr. Sanjay Kathuria, who's an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University. I welcome Ms. Rushali Saha, who's a research associate at the Airpower Institute in New Delhi. And of course, I welcome Professor Doungel, who is a professor at Mizoram University, and currently he's in Cincinnati, Ohio, as a Fulbright visiting scholar. So I welcome all three, and I request them to, in their presentations, to sort of go beyond the confines of their papers and address, if they can, a little bit the Asian century. And so with that, I shall welcome them, our three presenters, and a very warm welcome to our audience, which comes to us from Southeast Asia, from the United States, across India and India's Northeast. So a very warm welcome, and I look forward to an active participation. Thank you. Dr. Sanjay Kathuria is an adjunct professor at this time at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and also at Ashoka University in Sonipat, India. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in India, a senior non-resident fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and a former lead economist in the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He has a PhD in economics from Oxford University as an INLAC scholar. His most recent publications for the World Bank are Unleashing E-Commerce for South Asian Integration, co-author 2020, Strengthening Cross-Border Value Chains, Opportunities for India and Bangladesh, co-editor and author 2020, Playing to Strengths, a Policy Framework for Mainstreaming Northeast India, co-editor and author, A Glass Half Full, The Promise of Regional Trade in South Asia, editor and co-author, and Towards New Sources of Competitiveness in Bangladesh, a Bangladesh Diagnostic Trade Integration Study, co-author 2016. Sanjay's PhD thesis, entitled Competing Through Technology and Manufacturing, a study of the Indian commercial vehicles industry, was published by Oxford University Press in New Delhi. Sanjay is an economist by training and has lots of on-the-ground experience across South Asia, as well as the Caribbean and some other countries as well. So in his long stint of 26 plus years with the World Bank, he has brought about great amounts of his work is centers around explorations of trade, and with a lot of path-breaking numbers, which he crunches down into very assimilable ideas. So he is constantly interpreting for us from this mass of data some very wonderful conclusions that he draws. So with that, welcome Sanjay, and please begin your presentation.
Initially, I thought I'd present a PowerPoint and so on, but I think I'm just going to speak of my notes, and hopefully that will make it even more accessible to everybody. So thank you very much for this, for inviting me. I was there yesterday also at the ambassador's remarks. I heard them, and yeah, it was very, very useful and enlightening. So thank you for that. So today I'm going to speak about China's growing economic presence in South Asia. And let me start with just as Harish said, I have traipsed around South Asia for many years personally, and it's a current passion of mine, and I seek to bring some of my own experience into the teaching that I'm doing now in Georgetown and Ashoka. Now, when I was in Sri Lanka, I spent many years working on Sri Lanka, and I noticed when we used to go down for breakfast to the Taproben coffee shop in the Cinnamon Grand. Unfortunately, this was one of the coffee shops that was bombed during the Sri Lanka Easter bombings 2 years ago. But when over the course of the last 5 years or so, when I used to go there, I just noticed anecdotally every morning at breakfast, compared to, let's say, the previous time that I visited, or compared to the previous year, I always used to see more and more Chinese visitors in the coffee shop in the morning. That's just anecdotal evidence, and I will buttress it, during the course of my talk with real numbers. So I want to start with a quote, a kind of a quote or something that the Chinese ambassador in Dhaka said very recently, I think last week or so. at a remarks he made in a sort of gathering, and he said that Dhaka will risk significant damage to its relationship with Beijing if it cozies up to the Quad. And I will talk more about this, but this is a kind of perspective that I think is important for as a background when I explicate on these remarks on what and all of you will know what the Quad is. It's basically a quadrilateral framework which started a couple of decades ago, but has become more salient in the last couple of years. And this brings together Australia, India, Japan, and the US. All right. Okay. So in my remarks, I will touch upon 5 themes. One is, what are Chinese incentives here for getting into South Asia? What's part of their overall game plan, such as we can discern it? I will talk about the different modes of economic engagement that they have had and what has happened there. I will talk about how China lends and do 2 case studies in that context. One is the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the second one is Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Then I'll talk about really from a country perspective in South Asia, what's happened from their perspective, very briefly, talk about the tilt, a very real tilt that has taken place towards China. And then finally, some brief thoughts on what is and what can be India's response. Okay, so let me start with Chinese incentives to do what they do, right? So now, obviously, China has grown at a breakneck speed, is one of the great success stories of economic development, in the last, since 1980, 81, when Deng Xiaoping launched reforms. But, China has it seems, has almost outgrown its market, in the sense that it has massive capacity for investment. Its investment to GDP ratio is almost an unprecedented, has been at some points has hit 50% of GDP, which is pretty unprecedented. So China needs avenues for investment. It has a lot of capacity for investment. So it needs demand. It needs demands for its investments, for its capital. It needs resources. It's a gargantuan economy. It needs constant resources. Its investment to GDP ratio is almost an unprecedented, has been at some points has hit 50% of GDP, which is pretty unprecedented. So China needs avenues for investment. It has a lot of capacity for investment. So it needs demand. It needs demands for its investments, for its capital. It needs resources. It's a gargantuan economy. It needs constant resources. It is also, people who study India and the India-China relationship in IR. I'm not an IR expert, but there is enough talk about this for me to kind of imbibe some of this. But so the desire of China, the question is it inevitable that there are 2 giants sitting, next to each other, and that there is a clash inevitable? I don't think, in my study of world history of global economy, such as it is, I have not seen this kind of 2 global giants coming up side by side, in next to each other, right? So in a kind of world history, looking at world history. So maybe China and Russia to some extent, but I think this kind of the rise of global India and global China seems to be of a different order. So is a collusion, is a clash inevitable? I mean, that's a question. So in any case, people interpret China a desire to contain India. So because it has its own needs of access to resources, and it feels that and it needs to contain India in its own backyard. So hence the string of pearls kind of, and the illusion that is often made. And then of course there has been the recent standoff and violence on the Ladakh border with India. Well, and then beyond all these rational incentives of demand, resources, and access, and all of that, there is also people talk about the big power ambitions of China. Again, I will not talk much about this because that's not my area of expertise. I will stick to the economics, but there is all of that as well. There is the big power ambitions and the rise of China, and as Raja Mohan has said, that does the rise of China does it itself contain, at least in China's mind, the demise of an Asian century, but it is more like a Chinese century. Right? So because its own rise has become so inexorable and so large that perhaps it sees itself as bigger than Asia itself, or it is Asia. So much about the incentives. So now let me go to my second theme, which is more on the concepts of economic exchange. Right? We all know, and this is now I'm getting much more into my own home territory of economics. So there are so many forms of economic exchange between countries, and each one is extremely important. If you look at the data between, say, 2005 and 2019, if you look at China's presence in South Asia and compare that to its growing presence in the rest of the world, we know that China is a global trading behemoth, right? It is the most dynamic growing part of world trade, and it has made a huge impact in every country, almost in every country in the world. Now, China's share in world trade between 2005 and 2019 grew by about 4.5 percentage points. So roughly from around 10% in 2005 to about almost 15%, 14.5% in 2018, right? So remember, about 4.5% increase. On the other hand, its share in South Asian imports rose up by almost 7.5 percentage points between 2005 and 2018. In South Asia as a whole, from about 8% to about 15.5%, right? And if you look at some countries, it's actually increased much more. So in Sri Lanka, it rose by 12 percentage points over this period. In Pakistan, and here you would not be surprised, in Pakistan, it rose by almost 15 percentage points. The share of China from about 9.3% in 2005 to about 24% in 2018. And this started with China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement in 2006, and then it has continued, that kind of inexorable increase in. So what I want you to leave here is remember, so China is increasing its share in South Asian trade disproportionately compared to its impact in world trade, right? So it's always good to have that as a counterfactual, because China is, as I said, is a giant in world trade, but its presence in South Asia is even much greater, or its increase in its presence is much greater than its increase in world trade, right? So that's the important thing to remember, and way higher than its increase in world trade, and in particular in Pakistan and in Sri Lanka. These are two economies where it has had a great disproportionately increasing influence. But even in the rest of South Asia, and just to give you a sense of that, in India too, right? So India, we all think of India as a competitor to China, but the share of China in India's imports has gone up from about 7% in 2005 to about 14.5% in 2018. Okay, so even in India, its share of Indian imports has almost doubled in this period that I'm talking about. Okay. Meanwhile, while all this has been going on, India has been slowly losing its share in South Asian imports to China. So unlike India's slow, not as spectacular as China by any means, but a slow increase of India in world trade from about 1.2% in 2007 to roughly 1.5% in 2018. This is share of goods. In all cases I have been talking so far of trade in goods. So India increased roughly its share in world trade from about 1.17% to about 1.5%. But in the rest of South Asia, it has been losing market share. Okay, by a significantly 1 percentage point, 2 percentage point in the rest of South Asia. Okay, so the trade story is that China has been increasing disproportionately, and India has been gradually ceding ground to China in South Asian trade. Okay, now briefly on the rest of the current account, I won't go in a lot of detail. India, for example, in tourism, India was dominant in terms of providing tourists to the rest of South Asia, but China is increasing numbers in the last decade or so. China is catching up in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, where India is certainly dominant, but China is a dominant player in the Maldives. But China is increasing its share of tourist arrivals in all of South Asia. In students, as a recent paper by CSEP has reminded us, I think it was a bunch of colleagues in CSEP, including Constantino Xavier and his colleagues, who looked at the share of students going from South Asia to India and China, and that there are now, as of 2016-17, the latest data that they collected, there's an equal number of students going from South Asia to China and India. But if you include Pakistan, then it's way different. Then it's disproportionately the total number of students from South Asia going to China is far exceeds that going to India. Okay. Now, so much on the current account. Now let me start talking about the capital account. And the capital account is here. China has been, in terms of foreign investment, has been a very big source of foreign investment, which is whichever country you look at, right? And it is kind of ceded. India has ceded that space to China in many countries. But here, what I want to focus is on the debt part of the capital account. So let me start with bilateral debt. As of end 2019, China is a big creditor to many countries in South Asia. All right. So it is the largest for Pakistan. Again, you may not be surprised. And here I'm talking of bilateral debt. So if you look at bilateral debt, 63% of all of Pakistan's bilateral debt is held by China. It's 80% for the Maldives, right? And it's there for many other countries. So, but overall, if you look at overall external bilateral debt, right? China is by far the largest creditor in South Asia. It's, as of 2019, $25 billion were owed by South Asia to China. Now, just to put this in perspective, this equals the share of the Asian Development Bank in South Asia. $25 billion Asian Development Bank, $25 billion China. The World Bank, $35 billion. So China is quickly catching up there. In terms of bilateral debt stock, as I said, the biggest biggest debtors are Maldives and Pakistan. And now, just for a final perspective on debt, if you look at overall external debt of some countries, not just bilateral now I'm including multilateral private debt, external debt stocks of, there were 7 Asian countries which were studied by in this data that I'm going to present to you. In the case of the Maldives, more than 40% of Maldives' external debt was held by China. In the case of Pakistan, it is more than 20%. And in the case of Bangladesh and Nepal, it's sort of less than 10%. So, but these are these are kind of the warning bells. And now I want to, so I'm going to talk a lot more on this theme of debt, because I know that is what exercises a lot of people. So I'm going to talk about now about how China lends. And in this, I'm fortunate because this is a very opaque area until very recently. It still remains very opaque. But we are fortunate that there is a recent paper, a very detailed paper out on this. There's a very detailed study of 100 Chinese sovereign lending contracts studied by Aid Data, come out in March. They got access to 100 detailed sovereign debt contracts executed by China bilaterally, and they studied these at length, right? So a very careful study, and I think all borrowing countries would do well to study this this paper. So what's the summary of this paper by Aid Data et al.? I'm not going to be able to do justice to it because it's very detailed, but here's 4 or 5 main conclusions. One is that China has very far-reaching confidentiality clauses in its lending arrangements to not disclose any contract terms, right? So, in fact, it even goes beyond that. In some cases, China does not even want the borrower to reveal that it has indeed the existence of the borrowing is there. They don't even want that to come out in the open. So there is extreme far-reaching confidentiality clauses in this. 30% of the contracts and 55% by the loan value of these contracts required special bank accounts for security and which is kind of a non-transparent collateral. You can call it like an escrow account, where you're preempting resources into a bank account, and China can draw on those in case the borrower has difficulty repaying. There are no Paris Club clauses in 75% of the contracts, which means, to put it in simple terms, Paris Club is a joint organization of bilateral donors and multilateral donors. Well, China does not join these, right? So it excludes these contracts by their very nature from joint restructuring and comparable debt treatments, right? So if there is any need for restructuring the debt, if there is default, then China will insist on special treatment for its debt compared to others, right? If the borrower is in difficulty. It also, the contracts contain cross default clauses, which means if there are default in any to any other lender, it will trigger default clauses to the Chinese loan as well. And then finally, there are several of the contracts contain very novel terms that amplify the lender's influence over the debtor's economic and foreign policies, right? Such as the Chinese Development Bank's contracts in the sample included the termination of diplomatic relationships in the event of default, right? So there are very far-reaching clauses in these, and it's remarkable actually that they had access to this and studied them at depth. And the only reason they got that was because many of the countries, the borrowers in African countries, and they studied. There were a lot of African and Latin American contracts here that, because the national governments, because of the parliament, there is oversight by law, and therefore, despite the clauses, China cannot prevent their being in the parliamentary records or on websites, Ministry of Finance websites, and so on. Okay. All right. Now let me get to my next topic, which is 2 case studies, which is very much related. 2 case studies of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Hambantota port. Okay. So as we know, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is China's flagship project when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, which it's a multi-faceted. It includes power plants, nuclear, fossil fuel, renewable. It includes ports, airports, economic zones, transport, highways, transmission lines, and so on. You name it. It was conceived as a $62 billion flagship project, mix of loans, foreign investment, and so on. And it became the economic peg of a wider strategic relationship between China and Pakistan. And in Pakistan, certainly they set a lot of store by CPEC. They see it as the solution to a lot of the current economic travails that Pakistan is going through on energy, on connectivity between the north and south, and so on. However, the problem is that the China-Pakistan economic corridor has seen a lot of issues come up, and a lot has been written about it. But unfortunately, because it's part of Chinese practices of lending, non-disclosure, and so on, a lot of it is not, even within Pakistan, there are a lot of complaints about opacity of lending, and again, contracts not being disclosed. So scholars have not really been able to study it in depth. But despite that, some people have done some innovative work and got access to resources, footages, filming, and so on. Long and short of the story is that project costs are rising. There is a feeling that the projects are driven more by China's than Pakistan's needs. And after a lot of, there was the Prime Minister Imran Khan ordered a review of a particular power project where there were allegations of corruption. The committee found severe corruption and went into billions of dollars, and they put that particular energy project on a kind of hold or reduced the size. I forget what it was, but the long and short is that China-Pakistan economic corridor will be reduced in size as a result of all of this, and obviously there are delays in implementation which are to be expected. And I quote from The Economist that CPEC will not serve as a model to the world of a new form of relations with a magnanimous China in which mutual advances in security and economic development are forever blissfully intertwined. I think this is diplomatic speak, but obviously it has not lived up to its promise. And I'm sure that people will have a lot of questions about it in their own minds, like I still do. But it has not come out to be, obviously there will be gains to Pakistan, especially on energy, but the question is at what cost, right? Because there is a heavy debt component to all of this. The second thing I want to talk about is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, right? I'd rely in what I'm going to say to you almost exclusively, but not only, on a New York Times article of 2018 by Maria Abi Habib. Very detailed, long read by her. And, went into, spent months doing research and talking to policymakers, scholars from several countries in the region, including Sri Lanka. So very briefly, you can read all, it's publicly available without any paywall on this particular case. So there was a strong Chinese support for the government in the civil war, we know that, which ended in 2009. The Hambantota port project was conceived by the former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, now currently the prime minister. He wanted it in his home district. All advice was against the construction of that particular port, including from his own officials. And Indian companies were approached, according to this NYTPs, but Indian companies said no, because it was said to be a kind of a white elephant. It would show no returns. So then Sri Lanka approached China, and they got an initial loan from the Chinese Exim Bank, which required, of course, the use of the Chinese company, China Harbor. And there were many, it included terms, even including sharing of intelligence on ships, of docking of ships. And according to this New York Times piece, there was strong support by Chinese companies for the re-election of the president in 2015. The president wanted to expand the port further, got a bigger and much more expensive loan from China subsequently, when left his country with a lot more debt at the end of his 10 years in office. So the new government, which came in place in 2015, inherited a huge debt repayment to China. China did not agree to write down the debt and asked for equity in the port instead. So in return for 85% of the port equity, China wrote down $1.1 billion of debt. So this was the price that Sri Lanka paid. And this is often touted in the popular literature on BRI as an example of how not to go about Chinese borrowing. Okay. So on last but one theme. So now coming to the situation in the countries, right? So I've gone through these different aspects of my talk. So from the viewpoint of the countries, right? So individual countries, there are contrasts in their positions, but it is clear that there is a perceptible shift in economic penetration, Chinese economic penetration of China, right? Of South Asia. And even if there is a regime change, as happened in the Maldives, so Maldives, there was a regime change last year, but the actions of previous governments can constrain what current governments can do, right? It contains, because of the clauses in those agreements, which are confidential, but as I said, have been studied in some depth. So they constrain the autonomy and freedom of action of the even if there are successor governments. So this happened in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, despite the governments who came subsequent to the governments that had negotiated the loans, but they could not really do that much to change, to alter the situation on the ground. So Pakistan, of course, we know has deep strategic and now economic relationship with China, and the CPEC has added the economic dimension to its relationship. In Sri Lanka in 2019, there was a return of a regime which is perceived to be more friendly to China than the previous regime, which was supposed to be more equidistant between India and China. In Nepal, there has been more of a tilt to China under the current regime of in the current dispensation. But of course, the politics are in turmoil. Okay, more recently in Nepal, we don't know how that's going to turn out. Bangladesh is a very, very interesting example. It has been keeping a more neutral stance and been seeking assistance from both China and India. China helped in its flagship Padma Bridge project, but India has also provided the largest bilateral aid package in its own history to Bangladesh. But now I come back to the statement of the Chinese ambassador recently, and keep in mind that China is saying, even though Bangladesh has made no overtures to the Quad, nor has the Quad made any overtures to Bangladesh, but China has, in a preemptive way, said, warned Bangladesh against warming up or cozying up to the Quad. So as Raja Mohan said a couple of days ago in a piece in the Express, as South Asian countries deal with China, they will see, I quote, but each of them will discover on their own the joys of dealing with the new hegemon on the South Asian horizon, right? So far, they were used to playing off China with India, right? So to balance off India. However, now that China is also asserting itself, this balance becomes more tricky. It's no longer a balance that comes without any kind of strings. It's not merely you can say that I have China to call upon, because China is flexing its muscles. And finally, I know I have taken long, but finally, India's possible response to China's growing presence. Ideally, global development, speaking as an economist, global development, God knows there are so many needs, both on infrastructure, as we know now in healthcare, then the pandemic and vaccines and healthcare infrastructure. The globe needs global giants to work together, right? But this is there is balanced by strategic realpolitik and so on. And India needs to protect its own interests in South Asia and then beyond. So, speaking from that point of view, India cannot match China on economic terms, right? But it can continue to leverage its own strengths, which are its culture and cultural proximity, geographic proximity, its soft power, which I don't think China is in a position to match, at least so far. It's medical services, and it's more transparent practices. I think this is a big contrast. It's much more transparent practices when it comes to aid, and more people-oriented project selection when India practices aid. And India has, of course, now taken strong steps to decouple itself from China when it look at, for example, on BRI, on the regional, on the RCEP, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership, deeper economic and strategic linkages with Quad and the Quad Plus. I would say India has shown a newfound sensitivity to its neighbors, perhaps prodded by China. And I think, irrespective of anything else, this newfound sensitivity should stay and continue to be deepened, because I have seen in my own travels all too often, sometimes India's official and sometimes even non-official machinery kind of display a hubris and arrogance towards neighbors, which I think appears to have been chastened in more recent years. And I would think that is welcome, whatever the provocation, and I think that is should continue and deepen. And I think that way India will also differentiate itself and become more, not just an important partner, perhaps also a more vital and a trusted partner, which is very important. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay Kathuria, for that illuminating and enlightening exposition on how China has made deep inroads into the South Asian countries, and what should be and is and what can be India's response to these incursions in its own sphere of influence, which is the South Asian region. You brought up 5 aspects in your presentation, which are: what are the Chinese incentives and the game plan to enter South Asia? What modes of economic engagements are they employing? The Chinese banks, the Chinese government and their companies, what their lending processes are, and what they hope to gain from their perspective, and what can or should be India's response. You pointed out very correctly that China has outgrown its domestic market rapidly, and therefore it's been needing external avenues of investment and demand for many years now. But you also point out that it's very rare to see 2 global giants, China and India, grow simultaneously in such proximity with each other. And therefore, you wonder, is a clash inevitable? You also question whether it's going to be a Chinese century or a broader Asian century, with the Chinese playing an important part. You also warn that 63% of Pakistan's external debt is held by China, which does place Pakistan in a very, let's say, a very difficult and a sticky situation. You also point out that China has emerged as the largest banker to South Asian countries, which alarmingly equals the share of the Asian Development Bank and is closely approaching the World Bank's own share of lending in South Asia. And this makes me think of the ways in which the United States itself became a creditor first to Europe after the First and Second World Wars. And then it makes me think how the US also started to lend these controlled loans to its countries in its sphere of influence, such as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. When the State Department unleashed its major Wall Street bankers, such as JP Morgan and others, as the private entities that entered these countries, such as the Dominican Republic, where they took charge of the customs revenues of these countries, they held the Ministry of Finance in its grip. They extended these American loans to them, and then they actually turned their economies around in favor of the American businessmen who were going to pour into these countries. We saw the same thing happen in Cuba. And so these controlled loans became an instrument of the State Department's foreign policy, whereby a controlled loan made an inroad into the country, the target nation, followed by the State Department, which then implemented a foreign policy which was in coherence with their American objectives of keeping the Western Hemisphere safe from the encroachment of the European predatory powers, the lenders from Britain, France, and Germany. So I was wondering, Dr. Kathuria, whether you think that China is taking a page out of the US old controlled loan playbook. How China lends, you've pointed out through some new documents that have emerged on the confidentiality clauses that China writes into its loan agreements to countries such as Pakistan and Sri Lanka, where the borrowing country cannot reveal any of the details of the clauses contained in those agreements. And therefore, in such ways, you point out, Dr. Kathuria, that the Chinese lenders, in these cases, the Chinese government, through these very, very interventionist clauses, is that the Chinese are encroaching into areas of foreign policy, that they might even be dictating the sorts of foreign policy that Pakistan and Sri Lanka and other borrowing countries follow. And so this makes me think how China is acting fairly closely to how the US acted in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba, and Haiti in lending these so-called controlled loans. So with that, I shall only add that you also point out that the CPEC, which is China's flagship project in its Belt and Road Initiative, it runs through Pakistan mainly, and there's a lack of transparency, and this is out in the public domain already. Project costs are rising, and it is bedeviled by corruption. You also point out that there's a Chinese hand in support for the re-election of the president of Sri Lanka. So there you have, through these sort of controlled loans of China, you have intervention in the domestic political arena as well. So we see the emergence of hegemony, a hegemony coming from the People's Republic of China, which is financial in nature. And through these hegemonies, we're going to see an exercise of a broader hegemony across societies in these countries. Civil societies in these countries may oppose it, but the foreign policies and domestic politics of these countries are at risk. And therefore, India's response, you point out that surely India cannot possibly match the financial power of China, but it can outdo China in soft power and in coming up with its own sort of lending packages, in concert with Japan, Australia, the United States, to these same countries, in the South Asian region, which will be offered, which should be offered fairer terms, transparency, and no ulterior motives or foreign policy linked encroachments. And therefore, I applaud you for the forthrightness of your presentation, and I look forward to your detailed elaborations as this conference proceeds in the next couple of minutes or hours. Thank you very much, Dr. Kathuria. So our second presenter for the evening is Ms. Rushali Saha. Her paper is about the Indo-Pacific as a construct, and it focuses on the increasing rivalry between the United States and China in this region. Ms. Saha is currently serving as a research associate at the Center for Airpower Studies in New Delhi. She holds a master's degree in politics with international relations from Jadavpur University. She graduated summa cum laude from the same university with an undergraduate degree in political science. She has published some of her work as book chapters in leading journals such as the Indian Foreign Affairs Journal, Political Review, Defense and Diplomacy Journal, Airpower Journal, South Asia Journal, and international platforms such as South Asian Voices, Nine-Line, Modern Diplomacy, the Kutneti, Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, the Geopolitics, South Asia Monitor, etc. Her research interests include the evolving geopolitics of South Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, with specific focus on Indo-China relations and Indian foreign policy. So Ms. Saha is talking about a topic that has been in the air for a few years, and it's a topic that is not going to leave us, and we'll be, I guess, talking about the Indo-Pacific and the jostling between the United States and China for a long time to come. So with that, Ms. Saha, please give us your presentation.
So my paper is titled Indo-Pacific in the Era of US-China Great Power Competition. Let me first begin by outlining why this region is so important. I think the fact that it hosts 38 countries and accounts for 44% of the world's total surface area, 65% of the world's total population, 46% of all the trade flows in the region, really points to the geo-economic importance of the region. Having said that, I think it is equally important to acknowledge how political the term is, as Dr. Mehta had pointed out in the introduction of the session, is that it is not purely descriptive, neither is it value neutral. Every country has geographically adjusted this term to suit their own national interests, which I think makes this region even more imperative to study. And the fact that it is emerging as the epicenter of US-China competition really attests to why this region is so important. Each country also has its own vision and strategy. And one important feature is that the regional order, so to speak, is quite in flux. But what we are witnessing is the emergence of a rules-based order. So therefore, any discussion on Indo-Pacific has to begin by acknowledging that not only is it difficult to geographically define the region's boundary, but the mosaic of different cultures and shifting power balances definitely makes it very difficult to come up with a concrete definition. So some scholars have defined it as an arc of countries which rests on Japan and extends southwards, while others look at the region as a whole and refer to it in terms of its relationship with the United States. In a sense, we need to understand Indo-Pacific as an ideational construct, and much like most terms in international politics, this very construction is an ingrained political act. Any discussion on Indo-Pacific is incomplete without referring to Asia-Pacific. Here, I'd like to draw your attention to the map, and I think the most significant highlight, if I may say so, is the exclusion of India. So, historically speaking, if you look at the construction of Asia-Pacific, it is an invented concept. In this sense, it essentially reflected a Euro-American vision, which expressed the demands of a nascent capitalist order, rather than expressing the needs which are intrinsic to the region. The extensive European involvement in the region dates back to the 15th century. Subsequently, imperial consolidation took place, and Asian powers came to hold a prominent position in this construct much later when they acquired significant economic growth. And hence, they were able to shift their position from being mere participants to active partners in the region. So before I go into the details of how US-China competition has evolved, I think it is worth revising, and also which was alluded to the talks previously about the rising hegemony and a revisionist power, which is threatening status quo. So before that, I think it's very important to address what has been the United States' role in Asia, which is why my paper tries to reflect on these points, where I try to look into why this region is so important to USA, what the goals of US policy in this region, what has been the nature of engagement, who are the key partners, what are the threats and challenges US faces, and how do Asians view America's role in the region. Here I've tried to provide a very broad overview of what US policy has been in this region throughout history, specifically looking at the interwar period, the Cold War period, and the post-Cold War period. In the interwar period, I look at the Pacific War. In the Cold War period, I look at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, or the US-Japan Friendship Treaty, the military alliances which it has built, and the impact of Vietnam War. And in the post-Cold War period, I refer to the pivot to Asia strategy and the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Briefly talking about the interwar period, Imperial Japan's unconditional surrender on 14th August 1945 left United States in an enviable position to decisively influence the fate of the region as it emerged as the decisive victor in the Second World War. Britain almost handed over America the position of its traditional place in the region, and therefore US emerges in a very pivotal position in Asia at the end of the Second World War. Moving on to the Cold War period, which I argue is where United States really established its position in the region. So although we see that the Pacific War was overwhelmingly an American war, we do see towards the end of the war, Soviet Union had strengthened in its role. And in the ensuing Cold War period, although Soviet Union did have a greater advantage in terms of geography and cultural proximity to Asia, American policies were arguably more powerful in this region. It is through a successful combination of using its naval and air power bases, evolving an alliance system, and through economic and cultural influences that America was really able to consolidate its position in the region. So let me discuss just briefly what are these alliances. So of course, the first mention would be of the San Francisco Treaty. When we closely look at the treaty, it really reveals how it basically turns Japan from a conquered and occupied country into a military ally, which is responding to the rising power of Soviet Union and China in Asia Pacific. In East Asia and Pacific, United States formed separate bilateral or trilateral security alliances to confront communism, and also attempting to establish a larger anti-communist multilateral security alliance in the form of SEATO, Baghdad Pact, CENTO, all of which collapsed during the 1970s. Simultaneously, United States also continued diplomacy at the bilateral level and signed a mutual defense treaty with Philippines and a tripartite security arrangement with Australia and New Zealand. In East Asia and Pacific, the United States formed separate arrangements, as I mentioned. So briefly speaking, coming to the Cold War dynamics which played out, the bipolar competition had soon developed into a tripolar USA, USSR, and China competition. And this was specifically visible when the Sino-Soviet split had become more pronounced. China did come to play a very important role in American strategic thinking, especially after it became a nuclear power in 1964. After this, as we know, a series of Sino-US rapprochement moves took place and normalization of relations. But it's very important to point out that this did not mean that competition was over, but only that it was now driven, the closeness or convergence was driven by the strategic necessity of the time, which was countering the common enemy, which was the Soviet Union. Now I quickly move on to the post-Cold War period. This period I've divided into pre-9/11 and post-9/11 because I strongly believe that 9/11 was a huge turning point for American grand strategy and in defining the regional geopolitics. So the dissolution of Soviet Union had actually provided the immediate rationale for a unipolar world, albeit for a very short period of time, but the United States was at the helm of international affairs. At the same time, it also removed the immediate rationale for existing American alliances in Asia, which was originally formulated to contain the spread of communism. On the other hand, we also see the emergence of what is touted as the East Asian peace, whereby the tensions between the major actors in the region was reducing. This had to do with China's peaceful rise narrative also, where it was trying to mend its relations with regional neighbors because it strongly believed that a strong, peaceful regional environment was necessary for its economic development. However, United States economic interest did not remain, only continue to grow since Japan and China, all these regions were seen as markets where United States could invest. Meanwhile, China registered great economic growth and consolidated its position in the region, which now brings me to 9/11 and how it sort of brings out the dynamics of American decline and rise of China. 9/11 was a huge blow to America's superpower status, definitely, because it brought home the fact that America was not the invincible power that it claimed to be. Moreover, a series of moves such as the Iraqi invasion, which did tarnish US image, the failure to halt the Asian financial crisis, its preoccupation with the war on terror, wherein it exclusively focused on the Middle East at the relative neglect of Asia Pacific as a region. America First, the narrative of America First, which began to emerge, through which questions were raised about whether America really has the commitment, the resources to uphold an international liberal order. Meanwhile, if we look at China's rise during this period, it quickly survives the damage to its international credibility by following the dictum of hide your strength and bide your time, which, if I may point out, as I will in the following slides, it has been replaced by the more authoritative Chinese dream, which is or national rejuvenation. An important development, of course, was China joining the World Trade Organization and emerging as one of the fastest growing economies. Its GDP growth rates was defined as the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. Another important development, of course, is the military modernization which China undertakes and its subsequent aggressive behavior. China also tries to gain legitimacy for its own governance model, and President Xi Jinping becomes the General Secretary of the Communist Party of 2012. And he lays out a very distinct vision for China's role in the world. Which brings me to the Xi Jinping era. Now here what you can see is that I have highlighted some of the quotes from his speeches, which I really think brings out his vision. So we've seen him repeatedly refer to the community of shared interest, the Chinese dream, the new model of great power relations, and of course the One Belt, One Road initiative. All of these measures are ways through which China is sort of challenging America's traditional role. Whether we look at the narratives surrounding BRI, whether we look at the Chinese dream through which China is trying to tell the world that Chinese development is not detrimental to the others, but if China rises, it will take others along with it, which is sort of hiding its larger hegemonistic ambitions, but I'll come to that in a bit. So because of paucity time, I haven't gone into details, but I think this statement really sums up what Chinese intentions really are and why Indo-Pacific is so important as the epicenter of US-China competition. So I'll just read it out. Although Chinese demands for changing the international system is selectively revisionist, but its stated intention only to revise those normative structures of international order which hinder its great power aspirations make the Chinese challenge a revolutionary one. Through its military and economic might, China is trying to influence the international environment, which not only recognizes but also appreciates the Chinese path to socio-cultural development. This brings me to the important part of my paper, which is situating China-US great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. Let me first talk about this very interesting survey that I came across, which was conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies program in Washington. And it's titled Power and Order in Asia, a survey of regional expectations. The first caveat is that this was, of course, published in 2014, which was prior to Trump administration, prior to the coronavirus pandemic. But it basically to these countries, the question posed was that which of the following countries will exert the greatest power in East Asia in 10 years? The survey reveals that 53% of the respondents believe that China would exert greater power in East Asia, followed by United States with 43%. Now, This also brings me to the post-Cold War pivot to Asia strategy. In many ways, the pivot to Asia was America's answer to Chinese rise. It sort of brings out the vital importance of the region to American foreign policy, which was recognized through this pivot. Hillary Clinton, in an article 2011, reinforces this position, and it defines it as stretching from the Indian subcontinent to the western shores to the Americas. The region spans two oceans, the Pacific and India, and the Indian Ocean, my apologies. Barack Obama also in his speech in Canberra had said the United States is a Pacific power. The main highlights of this pivot strategy was strengthening bilateral ties, making new ties, and building a constructive relationship with China. Going back to the same survey which I had referred to earlier, this survey asked respondents whether they support the Obama administration's goal of a strategic US rebalance to Asia. Understandably, the Chinese response was negative, whereas we see countries like India, Australia showing a more moderate response. This brings me to Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, and although I've tried to condense the most important highlights of it, but this basically brings out one theme, which is that under the Trump administration, United States completely let go of all its previous references to China, to a constructive relationship with China. In fact, the 2017 national strategy makes it very clear that Washington views the Indo-Pacific region as the top priority and identifies revisionist China as seeking to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, which is trying to reorder the region in its favor. The same was reaffirmed in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. The Trump administration's approach is very clear that it will counter China's military expansion. But the most important thing, I believe, is the overtly confrontational rhetoric, which is coupled with the shrinking channels of communication, leading to due to the overall downturn in relations, which has made the security situation particularly volatile. Coming to the question of whether Indo-Pacific will emerge as a military hotspot of the region or not. So I strongly believe that the most visible manifestation of the reprioritization of the region in US strategic thinking is the geographical shift in the US military's operations from Europe and the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. In fact, former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, he had explained that the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan was to face our greatest challenge in terms of great power competition, that is China. We've also seen military reorganization within the US Army, which is directed towards aligning its forces to suit the changed geopolitical circumstances. In many ways, Washington is saying that we have woken out of our strategic atrophy, and we will bolster our military presence in response to the Chinese. So how has China responded to this? China definitely sees Washington's exclusive Indo-Pacific concept as a way to contain China, and what it is doing is it's building alternative regional security architecture. And I think this is most clearly evident from the new Asian security concept and the release of the 2017 white paper by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, where it talks of Asia-Pacific security cooperation. China is making a case that it wants to take the lead in rule-making for the Asia-Pacific region. It is clearly averse to Washington's formal alliances in the region and wants to establish a hierarchical order with China at the top. As a result of which, what is happening is that we are witnessing China's aggression in the region in South China Sea, in East China Sea, sinking of Vietnamese boats, conflict with Philippines, and all of this is taking place when the world is fighting a global pandemic. Most significant development has been China's rising missile naval capability in the region, which directly is threatening the United States Navy's ability to achieve and maintain wartime control of the blue water ocean regions. I understand that due to the paucity of time, I won't go further into it, but one very important thing is how the Chinese indigenous built BF-26 intermediate range ballistic missiles is capable of striking US military facilities in Guam, which would affect the United States' overall position in the region. Let me quickly move to the role of regional powers in Indo-Pacific. Here, I again take you back to the survey, and here I draw your attention to the growing recognition amongst middle powers like India, Thailand, Australia, of a new community of nations based on strengthened multilateral institutions and cooperations. Therefore, although it is quite tempting to see the region only through US-China binary, it would be completely wrong, because the middle powers have a very decisive say in the region. And here I think it is very important to look at India's Sagar vision, which is the security and growth for all in the region, which is premised on inclusivity and ASEAN centrality, which although converges with the United States, is quite different from it. Through this, India is trying to sort of place its own importance in the region, where it is said that it will be a decisive voice in shaping the regional order in the region. It is clear that these countries do not want Indo-Pacific to be defined by the US-China rivalry. Their interests lie in ensuring that the regional sea lines of communication remain free and open, and that their vital trade partnerships also remain safe. Smaller Southeast Asian nations, which live in the shadow of the Sino-US competition, do not want to take a decision or overtly pick a side because of their economic and military and security dependence on these regions. While it is true that the middle powers are vulnerable to sudden changes in international system, but it is equally justified to say that middle powers have more stakes in their regional order as well as in the international order. Compared to the small powers who neither have great stakes nor interest, middle powers will try to benefit from the status quo and the revisionist power. The hedging strategy, therefore, which is taking place, has become their most preferred modus operandi. Not committing to either of the two or major powers has its own good and evil sides, of course, but the fluid strategic situation currently in the Indo-Pacific does play well in their favor. Let me just conclude by showing the latest Pew survey, which I found, which show the attitude in the Asia Pacific towards the United States. Here you will notice that the Asia Pacific countries still see value in strong economic ties with the United States of America, and they are also concerned about China's military might. And many see China's growth and investment in a positive way, but the Asia Pacific countries are particularly wary. Thank you so much. With this, I'd like to end my presentation.
So you have taken us through a historical approach to how the United States had formulated its engagement with Asia through the interwar years, through the Cold War and the post-Cold War, and what that tells us is basically that the United States has always seen itself as an Asian power. So that's one. That's a good fact that you brought out. And you have said that the regional order is in flux. So you might want to develop this a little bit in question time. The regional order in flux is worth dwelling on, because it's several regions here. So we look at Southeast Asia or South Asia in a little more depth, and of course the whole impact of China on regional play. You also said that we're seeing the emergence of a rules-based order. So this would imply, from your perspective, Chinese adherence to a rules-based order, for which I haven't seen much evidence till today. So you might want to tell us something you know that we don't, or I don't. So we look forward to some of your inside track on that. The Asia Pacific, you said, was an invented concept, which is very interesting, a formulation of yours. It was invented by the Anglo-Americans that excluded India. So this is a very important point which you might want to elaborate on, is also that which brings us to the whole idea of the decolonization movement, the freedom struggles, the reluctance to give pride of place to India, even after India got its independence, that there was this Anglo-American move to somehow create an Asia Pacific that excluded this part of the world for whatever reasons. And those reasons you might want to explore in question time. And I think one of those reasons is India's inward-looking policies, its import substitution, license Raj, which had cut India off from the trading nations of East Asia and Southeast Asia. When you talked about the Cold War, it made me think whether you think that there might be a new Cold War. There's been some talk about that. You might want to talk a little bit about that later on. You've done very well to talk about the Chinese dream and Xi Jinping's new model of great power relations, which are crafted to elevate China to a great position, to a pinnacle in global relations. But this new model of great power relations, if I recall correctly, calls for peaceful practices. So you might want to work in peace alongside the thrust into the South China Sea and the threatening and the building of islands and etc. The great power, how that works in tandem. I thought when listening to your paper that there's a certain common thread you have with Dr. Kathuria's paper in that is the Chinese rise mirroring US policies of the past? Whether those practices, what they did in the Caribbean in terms of their loans and lending, whether you see that the Chinese following the same styles in some ways, extending loans, limiting or restricting sovereignty and foreign relations, all of that. Your surveys have shown, one of them has shown China having greater influence than the United States in Asia. And your latest survey shows that still people in Asia prefer a greater engagement of the United States. So how do you reconcile these? Is there some way to look at these? Of course, there's a hardening of US policy since Trump. During Trump, there was. Can you bring us up to speed on that? What's happening at the current time with Biden? Are they still following the Trump hardline, or are they being a little more pragmatic in engagement of China? Your section on how does China respond with its alternative security architecture and its desire to set up a hierarchy, an all-new hierarchy which has China at the top. You might want to give us a little bit more, because this is exciting stuff, where a little bit stuff from Xi Jinping's new model for world relations. There's all communist stuff which scholars would love to lap up. So that I think we shall stop here. Middle powers will hedge. That's the only way they know. They want to be not on any losing side, but they want to extract what they can from the US market. The Southeast Asia had done a good job of that. And they want to also not lose out any opportunities that China might send, economic ones. So I think it's an excellent presentation, refreshing, with many, many new dimensions, which we shall flesh out during the question time. So with that, I thank you very much. And with that, I would like to move on to our third presenter, Professor Doungel, who is a professor at Mizoram University. And currently, he's in the United States, where he's a Fulbright visiting scholar at the university in Cincinnati. He teaches in the Department of Political Science in Mizoram University in Aizawl. His numerous publications include Evolution of District Council Autonomy in Mizoram. So his specialty is Mizoram, autonomy movements, constitutional matters. Being a political scientist, he does all of that. And Ram Darthalang, socio-political issues in the 6th schedule area of Mizoram is another of his books. Socio-economic development and governance in the northeastern region of India, proceedings of the National Seminar of March 2014 in joint editorship with Professor J.K. Patnaik and Dr. Shyam Kishore, which is another of their publications, Lai Chieftainship and its Impact in Politics, from Balaji Publications in New Delhi, and finally Autonomy Movements and the Sixth Schedule in Northeast, which he edited. So Professor Doungel, his talk is going to be how he sees Mizoram as a gateway. Now he's going to tell us a gateway to where and what is happening with that gateway. Has the gateway opened? Is there progress being made? Is it a one-way gateway, or is material going to flow from Southeast Asia into Mizoram? So Mizoram is ideally located for this job. You know, it's on the border with Myanmar, and its proximity to China positions it in a way that a few other states have that. So it occupies an important stature in India's Act East policy. And with those few words, I would welcome and request Professor Doungel to give us his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Harish C Mehta, for organizing this auspicious international conference. And we have heard the two presentations earlier, and I will focus on the ground reality. On the ground reality, what is really happening in the international border, and is change of this terminology from look to east really activate the project or not, that we will take into account. Significance of Mizoram in India's Act East policy. So let me start with the introduction. As we know, this Look East policy is an offshoot of globalization, privatization, and post-Cold War phenomena. What Cold War did and what was the impact of Cold War, that we have already heard from the earlier presentation. And as we know, India faced a grave economic crisis since mid-80s. And by the time when in the 90s and the late 80s and early 90s, there was very unstable government, many short-lived government in India. And at the top of that, this grave economic crisis came up. So during that time, then there were certain changes in international diplomatic scenario. Due to that, at that time, it was a must for India to shift its foreign policy to suit India with the emerging post-Cold War phenomena. As we know, the former Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, and from former Soviet Union, 15 sovereign countries emerged. And former Soviet Union was the main country upon which India depended for many things. So during that time, the experience and very an expert in international relations, P.V. Narasimha Rao became the Prime Minister of India. And this Look East policy was started during his time. And after Narasimha Rao, this policy has been followed vigorously by his successors, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Dr. Manmohan Singh. Then, what is the main focus of this Look East policy? The main focus of this Look East policy is that India must find its destiny by linking itself more and more with its ASEAN partners and the rest of the world. As I mentioned earlier, Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, and due to disintegration of Soviet Union, India was compelled to approach her Asian countries, neighboring Asian countries, for survival in economy and to counteract the growing influence of China in the region. So, to serve this purpose, India's main agenda is to look towards the east. India could no longer look towards Soviet Union. India could no longer look towards other direction. But so for survival, India has to look towards the east. In such a way, to look towards the east and to build up cordial trade relationship with the Asian countries, this Look East policy has been framed. And this Look East policy was classified into two phases, the first phase and the second phase, as we know. The first phase was from 1991 to 2002. And this first phase mainly focused upon the Asian countries to maintain trade relationship and to maintain relationship for investment purpose with the Asian countries. And the second phase started from 2003. And in the second phase, the coverage of this policy went beyond the Asian country, Southeast Asian countries. And it extends to Australia and other East Asian countries. In such a way, the coverage of the policy was extended in the second phase. And with the formation of NDA-2 government led by Narendra Modi in 2004. So this NDA-2 government is famous for bringing up with certain new terminology. Likewise, the Look East policy also has been changed into Act East policy since 2014 by Narendra Modi-led NDA-2 government. But whether this change of terminology from Look East policy to Act East policy has really activated the project or not, or whether this policy has been really activated or not, that will be focused in this paper. And this paper also will focus upon significance of Mizoram in the so-called Look East policy or Act East policy. But as I've mentioned earlier, it is doubtful whether change of terminology really activates the project further, or is it just a show of drama or oratory skill that we have to wait and watch. Now, as we have to focus upon Mizoram, let me highlight brief political history of Mizoram so that we may have more idea about it. Mizoram, earlier known as Lusai Hills, was domain of the chiefs in pre-colonial era. So Lusai Hills at that time was independent in its own way. It was under the domain of the chiefs, Silo chiefs and other chiefs of Lusai and chiefs of other ethnic tribes rule in the north and Lunglei region of the south. And in the extreme south, the Poi, Lai chiefs and Lakal Mara chiefs, they rule. And as Lusai Hills was more or less independent, Lusai Hills was neither under the influence of Burmese king, it was neither under the influence of Ahom king, Kasari king, or any Hindu ruler or Muslim ruler. It was an independent country, it was an independent territory, and it was never annexed by any outside forces before the coming of British colonialism. So that was the fact, and it was the real political history of Lusai Hills in pre-colonial era. And with the coming of these British colonial forces, the British colonial forces, British colonial administration established administrative setup in the neighboring Kachar, Chittagong, and in the plain area. And chiefs from Lusai Hills, they raided these British installations from time to time. And in 1871, Alexandra Pool Tea Garden in Kachar was attacked by Silo chiefs, Lal Savunga Silo and Benkoya Silo. Then they killed the British tea planter and kidnapped his daughter, Mary Winchester, and the tea planter who was killed by the raiders was James Winchester. Then that alarmed the whole world. So the British colonial forces could not digest attack upon their citizens, the tea garden by the people from Lusai Hills. And in order to teach lesson to the Lusai Hills and to save Mary Winchester, Lusai Expedition 1871-72 was undertaken by the British forces from two different directions, Kachar from the north and Chittagong from the south, and Lusai Hills was subdued, and Mary Winchester was saved from, and she was taken back. But after this, the British colonial forces did not remain in Lusai Hills because Lusai Hills was not that productive from revenue point of view. So they warned the chiefs not to raid the plain area again and leave them. But during that time, this raid and attack upon the plain area and other places were so of strength and valor for the tribals and tribal people and tribal chiefs. So raid continued from Chin Hills and Lusai Hills upon British installation. And as a result of that, Chin Lusai expedition was undertaken again in 1889-1890. Lusai Hills was attacked from two directions, from Kachar and Chittagong. Then Chin Hills was also attacked from two directions, from South Chin Hills and North Chin Hills. And as a result of that, Chin Hills and Lusai Hills were put under British administration. British administration was introduced in Lusai Hills since 1891. Then Lusai Hills was brought under British administration, and it was classified into two subdivisions. North Lusai Hills with headquarters at Aizawl, and South Lusai Hills with headquarters at Lunglei. North Lusai Hills was under the jurisdiction of Assam, and South Lusai Hills under the jurisdiction of Lieutenant Governor Province of Bengal. Then, after that, Lusai Hills was formally brought under British Empire with effect from 6 September 1895. And the two Lusai Hills were amalgamated into a single district, and it became part of Assam, known as Lusai Hills District, with effect from 1st April 1889. So Lusai Hills remained as District of Assam under administrative governance of political officer and superintendent during colonial era and under deputy commissioner after independence. Then Lusai Hills was accorded Autonomous District Council, known as Lusai Hills Autonomous District Council, later on Mizo District Council. And in the south, there was one regional council, Poi Lakal Regional Council, and this Poi Lakal Regional Council was the only regional council under the provision of 6th Schedule to the Constitution of India up till now. And as we know, insurgency erupted with the unilateral declaration of independence of Mizoram by Mizo National Front on 1st March 1966. And as a result of this declaration of independence, Lusai Hills was under turmoil for 2 decades, and even Indian Air Forces bombarded Aizawl and many other places in Lusai Hills. And During that time, Lusa Hills was upgraded to the status of Union Territory on 21st January 1972, and with the signing of Mizoram Accord on 30 June 1986, Mizoram has been upgraded to the status of statehood with effect from 20th February 1987. And now, Mizoram, which was earlier the most disturbed area, which was the most problematic area, which necessitated even the bombing by Indian Air Force, now becomes the most peaceful state of India. And Mizoram being located in internationally strategic location, it has its own significance in this India's Act East policy. Now we shall focus on the role of Myanmar and China in India's Act East policy. Now the role of Myanmar. Myanmar or Burma shares more than 1,600 common international border with India's northeastern states. And as we know, these northeastern states of India are linked with mainland India by just 22 kilometers corridor in Siliguri, which is known as the Chicken's Neck. And that's why this northeastern state has faced certain problems with regard to transport and communication to link them with the mainland India. So the basic necessities and requirements of northeastern states are obtained from Myanmar even before the legalization of trade, because border areas on both sides are inhabited by tribes of the same ethnic group. So far as the boundary with Mizoram and Myanmar is concerned, so on both sides of, whether it be Mizoram side or on the other side, Myanmar side, the Chin state, they are people from the same ethnic stock, from the same Zhou ethnic stock. Then if we come to Manipur, like the district which have international boundary with Myanmar in Manipur are Churchanpur district, then Chandel district, Teunopal district, then Ukhrul district. So in Ukhrul district, on both sides of the border, both sides of the borders are occupied by these Tangkhur Naga tribe. Then in some parts of this Ukhrul district, Teunopal district, Chandel and Churchanpur, both sides of the border are inhabited by people of the same Zhou ethnic tribes. Then coming to Nagaland, in the border of Nagaland with this Myanmar also, they are all occupied by the Naga tribes, and the same with Arunachal Pradesh also. In such a way, Myanmar has significant role, and due to that, Myanmar has important role in India's Act East policy. Then, what about the role of China? As we know, China was a hostile neighbor for India since India-China War of 1962. Then, China shares 3,488 kilometer international boundary with India. And Chinese influence has been expanding in the region, not only in the region, in different regions of the world. How Chinese role has been increasing, that we already heard from the earlier two presenters. So let me not focus more on that. And as we know, China tries to expand its influence not only in Southeast Asia, but in different regions of the globe. And China is the greatest competitor to United States, even in international politics now. So when China got contract for harnessing more than 2.88 to 3.56 trillion cubics of natural gas in Rakhine State. Not only that, it also got projects for installation and improvement of naval and surveillance installation in the Myanmar coast and Coco Island. So when China got this opportunity in Myanmar, it alarmed India. Due to that, India was compelled to start diplomatic and trade engagement with Myanmar. And this new diplomatic and trade engagement with Myanmar compelled India to activate Colodine Hydroelectric Project 2 and Colodine Multimodal Transit Transport Project Road. Earlier, these two projects were already planned by the government of India, but they were taken up in snail speed. But because of this diplomatic compulsion, the two projects are activated from snail speed to normal speed. As I've said, these Colodine HCP2 and KMMTP projects have been the long planned project of government of India. Survey also had been done, and the projects were, these two projects were under the initiative of Ministry of Home, Defense, and External Affairs. But that dormant project became activated, frankly speaking, due to Chinese factor. And how Mizoram is significant in India's Act East policy. So, to engage with Myanmar for further activation of these Look East or the so-called Act East policy, Government of India has initiated 6 projects in Myanmar and 7 projects in the Northeast India. So the 6 projects in Myanmar are Tamu Kaledwa Kalemyo Road, Kaladan Multi-Modal Transit Transport Project, ASLD Project, ISRO Data Processing Center, Truck Supply, then other projects. Then what are the 7 projects in Northeast India? Colodine Hydroelectric Project 2, HCP2, Colodine Multi-Modal Transit Transport Project Road, KMMTP, Asian Highway, Asian Railway Link, Natural Gas Pipeline, Guwahati Ho Chi Minh City Flight, and Infar Hanoi Flight. So out of these 7 projects in Northeast, 2 of the projects are located in Mizoram, that also in Long Klai district of Mizoram. Then besides these 2 projects, Land Customs Center, LCS, also begins functioning in Zaukathar since 1995 for border trade. And besides these LCS at Zaukathar, 2 other LCS are now in the proposal. One is at Zorinpui, Zauchasua at Long Klai district in the border with Rakhine state of Myanmar, and the other at Tlabung, Demagri in Lunglei district in the border with Bangladesh. And now we shall focus on Colodine Hydroelectric Project 2 or Colodine HEP2. So what is this HEP2? Then what is Colodine? So the so-called Colodine River. So this project is to be undertaken in Colodine River. And this Colodine River, locally it is known as Boinu by the Lai people, Lai tribe, and it is known as Beino by Mara tribe. In official name, officially it is known as Chimtuipui in Mizoram. But in the official version, it is written as Colodine. So I will present it as Colodine. And this Colodine HCP2 is a project for production of 460 megawatts of power. And besides this production of 460 megawatts of power, the other purpose is to connect Colodine River with Suiti Port in Myanmar by making it navigable from favorable spot. And not only that, also to supply good drinking water to people of the area. So it has three purposes. First, production of 460 megawatts power, then to make it navigable, to link with Port Suiti in Myanmar, and to make it as supply of drinkable water to people of the state. And this Colodine HCP2 is about to harness the potentiality of Colodine River with multi-purpose utilization. So this is Colodine River, and this is the bridge connecting both sides of these places. This bridge is connecting Longklai district and Saha district, and by the river side there is one village known as Kolso, and the other side of Kolso in Saha district, it is known as Kolso East, and the other side of Kolso, which is located in Longklai district, it is known as Kolso West, and the two districts are connected by this bridge, Colodine Bridge. And the HCP2 project is about to cost 5,000 crores, and the work is undertaken by National Thermal Power Corporation, NTPC. NTPC has started functioning in the area by opening office at Longklai in October 2009, but actual work cannot begin due to delay in submission of detailed project report by the Central Water Commission. And by the time this NTPC started opening its office at Longklai in October 2009, during that time I was a faculty in Government Longklai College in Department of Political Science, and I had interaction and I interviewed even these officers and engineers of the NTPC, what was the purpose of the project. And due to that, I knew many of the ground reality about this project. But though NTPC started opening its office at Longklai in 2009, up till now, the project cannot be taken up. And this HCP2 project is about to require more than 200 engineers as per the plans of the project. And besides these engineers, the project may also require skilled laborers, namely carpenters, welders, fitters, mechanics, electricians, gas cutters, grinders, etc. But as I've said, though NTPC started functioning in the area by opening office since 2009, up till now, the work cannot be taken up. So from this, we can know whether change of terminology from look east to act east is really acting or not. Is it really activating the project or not? Is it not show of oratory skill? Then engineers of NTPC, every time they get adverse report for closure of the project. Then for recommending for closure of the project, what are the reasons cited by these engineers of NTPC? Bad transport and communication. There was no good road. There was no big road for transporting essential items and essential requirements. Then the other, there was not enough stones and sands available in Colodine River or in the area to sustain and to support the project. Then the other reason, they said high cost of transportation. Then the other reason, they said isolated location of the place. But Government of India has taken firm decision to proceed with the project. Despite these adverse comments and adverse recommendation received and submitted by these engineers of NTPC, Government of India is firm in going on with the project. Why? It is due to external factor. So this is the Colodine River. I visited the Colodine River from Fuitezol side on 5th February 2022, and we were riding this speedboat in Koldain River. So this is also riding on the speedboat in Koldain River on 5th February 2021. And this is also Koldain River on the same date. Now, Koldain Multi-Modal Transit Transport Project. This KMMTP is a road project for construction of international standard highway which passed through Long Klai district. And from Long Klai town, that is from AOC van, from AOC locality, it should pass through the area, and this road should go as far as Akia. And the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, entered into framework agreement with Government of Myanmar in April 2008 for facilitating implementation of the project, this KMMTP project road. And in fact, this KMMTP also, just like the HCP2, it is almost a long forgotten project which has been activated, frankly speaking, due to pressure from external factor. So this is the road which passed through the KMMTP. Yes, we know this is Aizawl. Then this from Aizawl, this is the national highway. Then from this national highway, it passed. It district from national highway, and this is Zorinpui. This is the last border post of Long Klai district. Then from here start the Myanmar border, Rakhine state. Then it reaches Suiti port. Then from Suiti port by sea it will connect direct to Kolkata. So it is said that if this highway is open, then from traveling through this chicken snack to reach mainland from northeast, it takes more than 2-3 days. But by traveling through this route, Kolkata can be reached within 24 hours. So this is how the route is going, KMMTP. And this KMMTP road is aimed at establishing connectivity between Indian ports and Suiti port in Myanmar through riverine transport and road links with Mizoram. And the project has been initiated with effect from 10 October 2010 from Long Klai district in Mizoram. And this project aims to provide an alternate outlet to landlocked Northeast India, which heavily depend upon the narrow chicken snack at Siliguri. So if this KMMTP road project is successful, that means people of Northeast, they have the option to reach mainland India in a shorter time with a shorter distance. And the distance of the road is estimated to be 117 kilometers within Mizoram from Long Klai to Myanmar border post. And from border post up to Akep, it is 222 kilometers. And the detailed project report was prepared by Rail India Technical Economic Services RITES. And the road project is undertaken by 2 road construction companies, RDS and ARSS, and the work is going on in full swing. The estimated cost of the budget in the initial stage was 575.69 crore, but which has now been revised 2 times, and now the present allocation of budget increased to 1,011.52 crore. And this KMMTP road project aims to link Kolkata and other Indian ports through coastal shipping to Chitri on the Arakan coast. And it will also provide an opportunity to connect Chitri with Kaladine River from Mizoram and facilitate the connection through road connection also. Then from Myanmar side, it will connect from Chitri to Paletua to the Indian Myanmar border road, and it will be further connected to Longklai town in Mizoram. And this KMMTTP is expected to be the gateway between India and Southeast Asian nations for commercial and business activities. And construction of the highway is supposed to be completed within 4 years from the starting of the work, but it is already delayed for 7 years. It is already 7 years behind the proposed timing. And work is now undertaken in full swing, but ongoing works began to be disturbed from time to time due to compensation issue. The latest deadline was 30th December 2018, but that was also crossed by more than 2 years now. And we in the locality recently also 390 days was delayed by ban from the landowners because of this compensation issue. And this is KMMTTP road on 5th February 2021. So this is how the road is going on. So this road started from AOC Vang, and now it reached the Myanmar border post at Jotachua, Zorinpui. And the construction is almost completed within Mizoram, but Myanmar side remains unfinished, and which is also, so to say, to be disturbed by the present political tension in Myanmar. And one thing that should be noted is that now widening of the National Highway 54, which connects the last village of Mizoram, that means Tuipang, Longklai with Assam, covers a distance of 515 kilometers. And if this National Highway 54 is not properly widened, and if this is not properly repaired, it is not properly reconstructed, Mizoram and the northeastern state will not be able to utilize this KMMTP road. Why? If there is double land road or triple land road from Longklai up to C3, but if the remaining roads are not approachable, that means people of the state and the region will never utilize this KMMTP road. And now we'll come over to Zaukathar Land Customs Centers, Land Customs Station. So as per the agreement between India and Myanmar in 1994, customary exchange of locally produced commodities was allowed with 5% duty. Then, in pursuance of that agreement, Government of India set up 2 land customs stations in the region. One is at More and in Manipur, and the other one at Zaukathar in Mizoram. More, on the other side, there is Nampalong and Tamu. Then in Zaukathar, on the other side, there is Triao. So this Indo-Myanmar border trade became operational with effect from 12 April 1995. And this is Zaukathar. So this is Zaukathar Land Customs Station. Then this is on the entrance to Myanmar. And now in this LCS, there are now about 62 items which can be traded. And this Zaukathar is not up to the mark up till now. And officially it was inaugurated by Nirmala Sitharaman, who was the then Union Minister of State for Commerce, on 25 March 2015. Then with regard to this LCS, it has been made by Customs Department, and a sum of 87,34,000 has been generated during 2017 to 18 financial year. And this is Zaukathar immigration checkpost in October 2017 on our visit, on way back from our visit to Chin State, Myanmar. And so but the problem here in Zaukathar Trade Center is that the bridge is not good enough and it cannot carry more than 15 tons. Because of that, there are certain difficulties. Then this is the bridge which is connecting Zaukathar and Trial in October 2017. So the other state, the other side is Myanmar, Trial, and the other side is Zaukathar, Mizoram, India. And but here also, even if there is good road between this Zaukathar to Champhai, and the problem is that the road between Champhai and Aizawl is still one lane. So till this road is developed, this land customs station will never be utilized by people of Mizoram than people of the region. And this is the other side of Myanmar border, Trial in Chin State, Myanmar in October 2017. And there is now proposal for starting another border post at Zorinpui, at Trabung, in the border with Bangladesh, but it is not yet taken up. Then there is also proposal for starting another border post at Zorinpui, Zauchasua, in the last border point of this KMMTP road, but this is also not yet taken up. So this is the border post at Zorinpui. Here there is bridge. The other side of the bridge is Rakhine State, and I went up to that. So this is the border post at Zorinpui. And why Mizoram is significant? Because Mizoram shares 404 kilometer common border with Myanmar and 318 common border with Bangladesh. And one thing that we should know is that all these people who inhabit the border area, they are people from the same ethnic stock. Even before the starting of this border trade, before the implementation of this Look East or Act East policy, people in the international border area, they carried on trade and commerce and cultural and social relationship as village trade, because they are people from the same ethnic stock, and it is not disturbed by the law and order of the government, because as they are from the same ethnic stock, that relationship is going on. And I've already mentioned, so far as Mizoram is concerned, 4 districts of Mizoram, Longtai district, Saiha district, Nath Hill district, and Champhai district, they have common border with Chin State of Myanmar. And as they are people from the same ethnic stock, there is no problem in communication. Cultural and social relationship is going on. So that is the real status. Likewise, in the other border side, that means in Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, like different tribes of the ethnic group like Bom, Pang, Miria, and Lusei are there. Then Chakma are also there. And both these tribes are inhabiting the area. That's why from before, since pre-colonial era, these cultural and social relationship is going on. And in such a way now, 3 projects like Colodine ACP2, KMMTP2, and land custom stations have been opened. And due to that, as we know, Mizoram is located in this strategic location. And as Mizoram is located in this strategic location, the significance, the location, and the strategic importance should be taken into account. And as we know, why the project has been activated so fast now, it is frankly speaking due to external factor. And now let me come to the conclusion. So the ongoing project can be cited as direct outcome of appeasing Myanmar and checking China diplomatically. And the main factor for immediate pursuance of these projects in Mizoram are not for socio-economic development of the district, not for socio-economic development of the area or region, but main is security reason and Chinese factor. Of course, in case if these projects are successful, it may have some socio-economic development impact also, but that is only secondary only. So the primary importance is diplomatic, security, and external factor. And whatever it be the case, these projects, so now, whether these change of nomenclature from look east to act east really activate the project or not. As we know, KMMTP, completion of KMMTP is delayed for 7 years now, and Kolodine Hydroelectric Project 2, HCP2, though NTPC started functioning in the area from October 2009 till now, project is not yet activated. Then the land custom station at Zaukathar is also not developed up to the mark up till now. Then the two other proposals, land custom stations at Tlabung and Zaurinpuri, are still not materialized. So, taking all these points into account, then not only that, if the national highway connecting Mizoram and Assam and the state road from Aizawl to Champhai are not developed, people of the state and people of the region may never utilize these two projects and land customs station as it ought to be. In such a way, this change from look east to act east, has it really produced meaningful change in the ground reality? I think no much meaningful change is found in the border up till now. As I've mentioned, I visited the border area and I know it and I see it with my own naked eyes. So this is a fact. As a matter of fact, so this Mizoram, it has its own significance and it is in strategic location in the international border. So the significance of this Mizoram in the ongoing India's look east or act east policy should be recognized and should be rewarded properly. Okay, with this, let me conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Doungel. That was an eye-opening presentation. You have broadly said you would take us into the ground realities of what's happening on the international border. You've asked the questions, has the Act East policy really worked? Has it really been activated? You traced the evolution of the Look East policy, and then you asked, has the change in policy really been activated functionally, or whether it is just simply a change in terminology? You took us to the history from the colonial British era. You brought and you talked about how Mizoram's the central defining factor of Mizoram is its strategic location, and that's what gives it an important role in the Act East policy, its strategic location of Mizoram. You talked about the role of Myanmar in Mizoram trade because tribes on both sides are of the same ethnicity. And the same, you said, is true for Naga and Arunachal tribes. And therefore, Myanmar has a very important role in the Act East policy. And a lot of the impetus for concluding the long-stalled projects, you have argued, stems from the need to factor in the external factors, such as those in Myanmar, and the factor of increasing Chinese influence in the neighborhood. So the fact that China had got very important oil contracts from Myanmar had led to the activation of Indian hydroelectric projects because some action had to be shown. So you have broadly pointed out how important the external factor is, and you have gathered all this information, as you said, on the ground, which you have demonstrated through those wonderful photographs of yourself on the boats on the Colladine River and on the newly constructed roads. Some of them seem to be sort of half built and not completely finished. At least that's what they seem to me. So thank you very much for this detailed presentation, I would add, which will only benefit from, and all those who listen to this recording later on will learn a great deal from what you have offered us today, Professor Doungel. So thank you so much. And so now we, in the interest of time, I will not repeat the points that I had raised earlier for the all three speakers. So for Professor Doungel, you might want to elaborate a little bit more on showing us the direct linkage between the Act East policy and the external factor. You know, just a few points of actually linking up how this leads to that. So starting with Professor Sanjay Kathuria, could you please address some of the points of interest, and then if there after you've addressed them in brief, we would invite questions from the audience.
Sorry, sorry, Harish. Can you just give me the sort of headline questions?
Yes, very much. Yes, I think the document that you referred to with those confidentiality clauses, if you could address that in a little bit, and also if you could flesh out a little bit more about India's response, whether you think the soft power, how workable would that be in the circumstances of a rapidly growing China?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so sorry, the document is, I certainly recommend looking at it, and there are several podcasts which the team has has given or talked, and I've listened to at least one of those, and the document is it's very accessible. It's not written in there's no jargon around it. It's just mining a lot of data and putting out the information, and they've done a very careful job, and they've actually tried to put it in perspective. And they've tried to say that, well, a lot of the stuff that China has asked for is standard commercial, bankruptcy clauses, cross default clauses, and all is often done in commercial contracts. But some of it, that what the team, what they've uncovered is what China is asking for is more unprecedented in the sovereign debt space. In sovereign debt, it is not so usual to ask for these kind of clauses, and especially in terms of confidentiality. If now some countries override these clauses, right? Because Parliament, at the end of the day, Parliament is supreme, and if there are national laws already in place, which say that you cannot make anything that is, for example, where external debt is involved, then the country is obliged to make those terms public. So that's how the team was actually able to get these contracts based on those kinds of national laws which override anything written in the particular contract. So those contracts so you couldn't actually write in those cases. You couldn't write those contracts, or they were overridden by the national clauses. I think the point that the teams were trying to make is that, look, unless you have a debate, in a proper democratic structure, any project that is taken up, especially of large magnitudes, involving hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, then the projects need to be debated openly and in a public where scholars, intellectuals, and civil society can bring to bear their own thoughts. And first of all, whether the project itself should be a priority of the country, right? So I think, so China has sought this very unusual thing that they, wherever it has been possible, they have written into the contract that not just the terms, but the existence of the project itself should be barred from the public eye. So I think the other side of the story is, look, okay, let's say if I'm a borrower nation, okay, I'm a sovereign country. I have the perfect right to say yes or no, to refuse this kind of loan agreements from China. But as we saw in the case of Sri Lanka, which I detailed, okay, so Sri Lanka first went to India. Okay, maybe it's a preferred, it's a preferred lender because they're dealing with Indian companies and Indian aid systems, which are more easily digestible. But Indian companies obviously saw this project as non-viable, which current indications certainly indicate to still be the case. And so they said, we're not going to put money because we want, at the end of the day, we want to be repaid. So the team which did that, they mined this 100 project contracts. They said China steps in where nobody else comes, right? Okay. So the first question to ask is, why does the country borrow? Okay. So there are things which everybody understands, right? There are things that happen between lines. It depends on what kind of, who's on the other side of the table, who's negotiating the loans, are democratic practices taken into account at the time. So it's a give and take on both sides. So it certainly is not. I would say from an economist point of view, it certainly deserves countries which are entering into sovereign debt contracts, which have huge ramifications, even for your sovereignty of your economic and foreign policies. I think countries need to be very careful before entering into contracts which compromise or which constrain the degrees of freedom of economic and foreign policy. And I think in the case of South Asia, Bangladesh, at least on evidence so far, has been much more prudent than many other countries in the region when it comes to engaging Chinese borrowing and or lending. So in terms of India's responses, as I said that, okay, India economically its economy is a fifth of the size of China, right? So, and there is no way that it can engage or it can take on China in an economic space. Yes, it does its bit, and South Asia is its own neighborhood, so most of it, the bulk of its aid, at least in terms of volume, is contained or is for the region, for South Asia, compared to the rest of the world. Despite that, it is much smaller. Its aid program is much smaller than is China's. So what India does, and I sort of mentioned it in passing, is that I think India's aid architecture will need to develop much more and work much more closely with like-minded partners such as the Quad, and so see how the diplomatic and economic diplomacy efforts of Quad and the Quad Plus can work and enhance, leverage India's own efforts in the economic and diplomatic space, so that the sum is greater than its parts. And this is something that I am actually hoping to develop in a book that I will start writing soon. I have, it's a project that I will take on it's my next 12 to 15 month project that I am taking on in India on sort of the India-China issues in South Asia, including aid and economic diplomacy. But I think soft power and trust is not to be gainsaid, not to be downplayed. I think India certainly has had a problem, as we meant, and we talked about at length in that book that you cited, Harish, The Glass Half Full. India has had its share of problems in South Asia in terms of trust, because it is the 800-pound gorilla in the region. However, I think it has been chastened through several knocks that it has taken in recent years. And I think it is now trying to build an image of somebody who is not behaving in the way that it used to in the past, with hubris and arrogance, but in the role of, as one metaphor is, instead of big brother, you behave like an elder brother. That's one, you can choose your metaphor, but that's one metaphor that has been used. So it is now trying to become much more low-key, behave with less arrogance and hubris, and do things on the ground. It has relationships to leverage, people-to-people contacts to leverage, cultural and obviously geographic, but cultural ties to leverage. So all of that, I think, can make its own efforts. It can multiply the impact of its own efforts. And obviously, there's a long way to go. And it's certainly not lost the game in South Asia, by no means. It's still a very, very strong player. But I think it can do, play along these lines, use the Quad, leverage its own diplomacy, play up its own narrative in a positive and sensitive way, but be very, remain mindful of the concerns of its own neighbors, and make sure that its own policies, some of its own diplomatic or its own domestic policies are not counterproductive to its wider engagements in the region and beyond. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Sanjay. Now, if anybody from the audience has a question or a comment, this is the time.
Actually, I did have a question.
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir, I just wanted to know something, like from what I have been reading, is that in the West, it seems that this narrative that the BRI, the debt trap, is a myth. And there have been quite a few studies along that, and they specifically talk about how the Sri Lankan debt crisis emerged from pre-existing situations, and that countries are not being forced into it, which quite ironically is coming out of the United States of America. So what are your views on that, sir? So how do you think these narratives will affect the larger debt trap diplomacy discourse which is going on?
Yeah. So I think, at the end of the day, look, the real story is a lot more nuanced, as you're kind of hinting out there. The fact is that countries, when they run into problems, so all these clauses that are written in debt contracts, then that's when the real issues come to the fore, as Sri Lanka found out, right? So, and then China is cementing itself. For example, in Sri Lanka, it has given billions of dollars subsequently in, for example, in currency swaps. Only last few weeks, another currency swap arrangement was negotiated with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which, by the way, India has also provided to, because Sri Lanka, yes, Sri Lanka has an issue of external debt. It has a lot of bunching of external debt, which predates just a particular Hambantota port, or, so it has, yes. So there was a kind of debt-led boom, post-war boom, post-Civil War boom in Sri Lanka, which was not sustainable. And that was certainly not only because of the Chinese. It was kind of wide-scale borrowing, external borrowing, which created, and China was a part of that. And it's not, I don't remember the exact numbers, but China's debt numbers are growing as a share of the total in all of South Asia, and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and Maldives in particular, certainly Pakistan and Maldives, but growing even in Sri Lanka. BRI is, as I said at the beginning, there is a very strong economic rationale from a Chinese perspective for BRI, right? So, and it has a lot of surplus capacity, both savings of people, it has a very high savings rate, so that has to be used somewhere, and surplus investment capacity. So that's at the heart of the BRI, where the Chinese state is using along. So it's the state and the quasi-state. Sometimes there is a thin line between companies and the state in China, as we know. So there is a big push towards lending. Then you use that Chinese lending, Chinese contracts, Chinese companies, Chinese labor, all comes in concert to execute and build projects. There is very little scrutiny. So, so even if, let's say, the debt were to be open, the contract was open, but yet it is written expressly in the contract that there will be no competitive bidding. So it will be Chinese companies which will execute the project, and the cost of that is really not up for question. The cost is what the Chinese company says it will be, right? There is very little give and take on that. And there is Chinese labor, Chinese companies, all of that come in. As Pakistan is finding out, and there have been complaints, a lot of complaints in Pakistan, that there is very little spillover into the domestic economy of Chinese execution of contracts, right? Whether it is Chinese companies being used or Chinese labor being used or there being a spillover into the domestic economy of Chinese technology, right? So there is typically when you have foreign projects, you do benefit. The greatest benefit is not from the particular project, but from the spillover of that project into the wider domestic economy, right? That happens much less from these kinds of traditional big mega projects that China is executing through debt. And we have to remember, mindful of, as I said, who is on the other side when China is negotiating its projects, right? So I think typically, you might say that when you have a classification of regimes on the other side, they may not classify as fully free on the Freedom House Index or on the Democracy Index, right? So you understand what I'm saying, that the kinds of negotiation on the other side of the table is done with regimes who may not necessarily be classified as fully open. And therefore, there is less than full scrutiny on the other side in the democratic space, right? So I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Miss Rushali Saha, that was an excellent question that probed and provoked Dr. Kathuria to give us such a deep and a thoughtful response, and he's clarified for us the ways in which the nexus between companies and governments and on the one hand, and then the receiving governments, which are also not very highly ranked on the Freedom House Index, are to begin with non-transparent, creates for a very murky world. So with that, I will thank Dr. Kathuria for his excellent presentation and response. And we shall move on to Ms. Rushali Saha. And just to refresh your memory of one of the important issues you raised was, how would China respond to the US efforts to re-engage itself, re-intervene post the pivot, which never happened. And you talked about the creation of an alternative security architecture that China was planning, and that it wants to have a hierarchy with China at the top. Could you explain the broad outlines of that, and then tell us a little bit about, is this sustainable? I mean, for China to sort of have this architecture all behind its name, and do you think this is part of, you remember the old thing of the US world being called a Pax Americana, an American-led peace? So is this something like that they're trying to kind of work towards? Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your question. I think it's really important. Like, I was not able to bring out the arguments in the short time span which I had. So, firstly, I'd just like to clarify one thing, sir, which you had mentioned that about China being a part of the rules-based order. So, how I see it is that China is building its own narrative of what this rules-based order is. It's quite interesting that in their official pronouncements, they have in fact used these exact terms, which is rules-based order. But how they define it is very, very different from the US narrative. In fact, what the larger Indian narrative also, which emphasizes inclusivity. What they talk about is an East Asian exclusive multilateralism. So in their thinking, United States does not belong in East Asia, and that the role that it played of an extra regional power, it no longer holds it no longer holds its ground given the changed security environment in the region. Which is why I think that the Chinese definition of the rules-based order is not the same as the United States definition. Nevertheless, it's also important to note the very different or unique security situation in the region, where United States sees the region exclusively through a military lens, which will clearly not serve its purpose. Because if we look at the history of the region, or if we look at ASEAN, the whole ASEAN way speaks of an informal way of negotiations. They are very, very conservative about their sovereignty issues and territorial disputes. So such an approach will not work, which is where I think the United States is faltering behind. And this is something that China understands, being in the region and understanding the sensitivities of these countries, which is why the narratives which they are placing is not against ASEAN. In fact, if we look at the narrative surrounding Indo-Pacific, initially it began with a complete disdain, where it was described as sea foam, as the idea as sea foam which would dissipate soon. But after ASEAN released the outlook on Indo-Pacific in 2019, it has changed its narrative, and now it's trying to ask the ASEAN nations to work within the existing multilateral institutions while not discarding the idea of Indo-Pacific as a whole. So this is how the dynamics, sir, I see are playing out, which is very interesting, given that, of course, its revisionist ambitions, its hierarchical ambitions are very much in place, but that requires a finer reading. I think it's interesting to also go back to the Chinese concept of Tingxia, which basically talks about how China sees itself at the center of the world, the middle kingdom, so to say, where China was at the center and all the other countries were its subsidiaries. Now, although of course the narratives of peaceful development, harmonious world, etc. are all coming out, it is quite clear that China sees itself at the center of East Asia. And this is most evident from its expanding territorial claims as well. In South China Sea, through the 9-dash line, in East China Sea, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute. All these are simply expressions of how China is trying to assert itself and place itself at the center and effectively displace United States, while also reassuring the smaller Southeast Asian countries that it has their interests in mind. So that is how I see essentially this security dimension playing out. And as far as the new Asian security concept, which I spoke about, is concerned, it's quite interesting because actually even the Southeast Asian nations are responding quite well to that. And this also has to do with the economic dependence. I'm sure Professor Kathuria would explain this much better, but I think that the Southeast Asian nations are very economically dependent upon China, and they cannot sort of, afford to lose the economic connections with China, which is why they're also uncomfortable in choosing between United States and China, which is why China does not place these countries when it comes to security issues. They say that we will solve it bilaterally. We have bilateral channels of communication. They don't want to take it to the multilateral forums. They do not accept the unclosed resolution. They're trying to use the economic leverage which they have to solve these issues. So it's this interplay of economic and security dimensions which is playing out in this Asia-Pacific security concept. But at the heart of it, I feel that it's just an attempt to sort of, displace United States from the region by saying that it's an extra regional power. You don't know the historic context, the histories in the region. We know because we are a part of this, and hence we are best suited to serve the interests of the region. So that's how I see it playing out.
Thank you for that. And is there any question from the audience or any of the presenters to Ms. Saha?
So, if I might, I would just perhaps offer some thoughts on what Rushali said. Just to by a way of expanding on the U.S. Issue on, U.S. has become kind of more and more. Its trade policy has become very strange ever since Mr. Trump, walked back from the TPP. Which would have been a major, and President Obama really cast it as a core part of his pivot to Asia, and I don't think the next administration really understood that whole idea, and so walking away from TPP, which involved some critical Asian economies and gave the US a critical foothold, economic foothold in the Pacific, in East Asia. And now I unfortunately, this administration, the current US administration, also, which of course we welcome in so many ways, but it also does not give any indications that this is a priority, whether it would like to join CPTPP or do something more broadly on trade. In fact, if anything, it continues to talk in a similar way on protection. So it is, as Rushali said, it has allowed China to maintain its primacy, because at the end of the day, I firmly believe security is economic security, everything else is secondary, right? So it has allowed China to preserve that economic primacy in East Asia without fear of the US coming into its own backyard, as it were. And this is what I hope to kind of explore, and it will have, although I'm going to be focusing in my, what I mentioned in my book on South Asia, but I think because I will be talking about the concept of the Quad and the Quad Plus, and I think it will certainly have ramifications for Asia more broadly. And how can there be any, since India has also chosen to stay out of RCEP, can there be an alternative formulation where the Quad and the Quad Plus become also a very significant economic grouping, which will then at least allow a reasonable choice, if a choice indeed has to be made, on an alternative to some of the East Asian ASEAN economies. That yes, indeed, there is a powerful economic grouping also that I can rely on, rather than just talk in a much more kind of fuzzy concept of security. Yeah, I agree very much on that. Thank you, Rushali.
Do you have a response to that, Rushali?
Sir, I think the concept of Quad, which Sir spoke about, I think it's very, very relevant. And the whole dimension of Quad Plus, which is emerging, where it is going out of the strictly hard security dimensions of it, is a very positive development. Because as I mentioned, given the historical specificity of the region, they will be very averse to anything which looks like an alliance. So therefore, the Chinese narrative that Quad is an Indo-Pacific NATO is definitely, I see it as a Chinese propaganda sort of to lure the ASEAN nations away from the concept of it. But if it emphasizes more on the soft power aspects, on infrastructure, which I see is an emerging area of Quad cooperation, and more specifically on the economic aspects of it, it really brings down the narratives of it being an exclusive military alliance and strengthens the whole narrative of inclusivity and ASEAN centrality in the region. So the economic dimensions of Quad, I believe, are very, very important. And going forward, Quad Plus will be a very important platform for these countries to engage with the four countries and build the real inclusive, democratic, free, open, rules-based order in the region.
So thank you very much, and we move to our final leg of our presentations today. May I request Professor Doungel to after his excellent ground report, which I think there are very few people who have that kind of knowledge of the ground as he does, having traveled virtually every inch of those mountains and roads and rivers. And so, Professor Doungel, in your assessment, the the linkage between the push towards the look east, from the look east to the act east, is there a direct linkage? Is it a direct response to the Chinese incursions, or the Chinese incursions into, say, Myanmar in particular, which is sitting right on the border with Mizoram?
This is interesting point, and it is a fact which has been never disclosed by diplomats and decision makers. So, for example, as we know, after the democracy movement crackdown by Myanmar military junta in the 80s, India and Burma diplomatic relations was strained. After the entry of Chinese company in Rakhine State. Rakhine State is bordering Mizoram from Tuipang. Then, if that expansion is going on, India realized that there was no point of maintaining strained relationship with Burma. Whether it be military or democratic government, India has to engage. So realization came to the mind of Indian decision makers. And out here in the locality, the focus and the strategy is that to the local people, so socioeconomic development and this and that will be focused. But the reality is that is secondary only. The reality is external factor, Chinese factor. Why? Because in 2014, I attended one mega international conference in Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, with two of my senior colleagues, Professor Jagdish Lal Dewar and Professor Margaret Chozama. Both of them retired now. Then in that conference, there were participants from foreign countries, diplomats, professors, scholars. Then the other interesting point was that 4 formal diplomats of Southeast Asian countries who were diplomats in that country, those countries during the starting or during the implementation stage, initial stage of Look East policy were present. Then former External Affairs Secretary during that time was also there, and some officials from External Affairs Ministry and diplomats were also there. Then I knowingly tried to provoke them in that conference. So I raised this issue. So diplomats and decision makers, you spoke out different things, you didn't do different things. This, I mentioned it as academician. I told them frankly. So with regard to the 2 ongoing projects, KMMTTP project and Colodine HCP2 project in Mizoram. This project has been a long-term project of government of India from before, but it was dormant project. Why it is activated? Frankly speaking, I think it is due to Chinese factor only, security reason. Because Chinese growing influence is expanding in the region. To counteract that, India again maintain relationship with the military junta, and this problem, this process has been initiated again. So if you have any point to clarify in this regard, what I mean is that socio-economic development is secondary. The primary is security and diplomatic reason. Then none of them clarified it. None of them responds to my query. So I proved that that was a fact which they didn't want to clarify. And that's why even in that international conference, the topic was different. But in the whole 2 days interaction, our focus was only on China, 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 China. This is open secret. That's why, with regard to the ongoing projects, Look East policy project, or maybe Act East policy projects also, what will be focused and what will be publicized, may be different, but the ground reality is that it is external factor. It is due to diplomatic reason. That's why socio-economic development is not the primary factor. I think this is a fact.
As a final, very quick question to you, and that is about the Act East policy and the Look East policy. On the ground, is there a lot of awareness of these initiatives among the people of Mizoram and perhaps some of the other northeastern states? Do the people on the ground know about these policies? And since if Mizoram is being promoted as a gateway to Southeast Asia, are the local governments responding, or is the policy being implemented at the ground level?
Yeah, the thing is that
at the state level, for example,
in the ground level, sometimes it tends to be politicized. Politicized in the sense, particularly in this sixth schedule area, some political parties, they try to take advantage of it. This step has been taken up, this step has been started during our party's rule or party policy, this and that. But I told them, and I presented for awareness of the public. That means from the CHARS platform, then from civil society platform. I wrote a number of articles and I made presentation in local Mizo language also. Then I clarified there also. This is not to be politicized. It is the diplomatic policy and foreign policy of government of India. Whichever political parties is in power or not, this policy will go on. In such a way, there was no awareness at all earlier, but now in the ground, in the local language, awareness, seminar and symposium has been organized in different levels, and the people also begin to be aware now. And I also have been resource person in many of such local seminars to aware and to make the people conscious.
Well, that's very nice. Now, we have to close this session very quickly. Is there any question for Professor Doungel from anyone in the audience or the presenters? Would anyone have a quick question for him?
So I hesitate to go for if there's nobody else, I'll go.
Yeah, go, please.
Yeah. Dr. Doungel, I've had the pleasure, as we were doing this work when I was in the World Bank on the Northeast, I've been to Mizoram many times. So I understand very much, some of the things that you were saying. But I have a question, is that, as you know, there has also been an overall rapprochement with, India, Bangladesh has been, one of the strongest relationships that India has now in South Asia. And there has been a lot of agreements so it is opening up Northeast India's access to Bangladesh, to ports. So, as you know, recently the bridge was inaugurated over the Feni River. Chittagong port is now being allowed to be used for many things, and protocols are being put in place. So my question to you is that, given that the isolation of the Northeast, and so in many ways perhaps the Chittagong is such a natural port for the Northeast to be using, do you think even after, I understand that Kaladan, etc., is all being done, as you said, for diplomatic and strategic reasons, and even once it's in place and everything, but in terms of the actual usage of the infrastructure there, compared to, let's say, fully open, if Chittagong and other parts of Bangladesh were fully open to India's Northeast, do you think that the Kaladan and the other projects on the Mizoram's eastern side would still remain economically important, or would they really not be used that much? There would be continue to be more like diplomatic projects that were put in place.
Yeah. in regard to that, so from Mizoram side up till now, no work or no project has been taken up in connection with Bangladesh. And as I've mentioned in my presentation, there is proposal for opening of land custom station in Demagari, Tabuk. But this is also still in the paper. It is not taken up. And as we have suggested, if there is good connectivity, particularly with Mizoram also, like the connection with in that Karnafuli River, this has been the age-old connecting route since pre-colonial and colonial era also. But after independence, as being already separated by international border, there are certain difficulties. So it will be a good step, and it will be a good for communicating, particularly with the people of Mizoram also, but no appropriate step has been taken up till now. And having said that, this project will go on, but on the other hand, like this KMMTP, so far as Mizoram is concerned, its importance may not be lost. So both will be productive. That's what I feel.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Doungel. Thank you very much for that question, Dr. Kathuria. I once again thank all three paper presenters for their extended presentations. We did allow today our presenters to present at will. So this sort of freedom to present such lengthy papers is an innovation of Rising Asia Foundation. Scarcely will you find in the world a conference that will allow you to go on at such length and develop your arguments with such freedom. Having been under the hegemony of many a very assertive chair across various hegemonies in the West, I'm talking about these international conferences. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. There are very nice things to be said for lengthy discourses, and we have allowed each one of you sufficient time, and so you can never fault us for that. You might say we gave you too much time. Well, thank you for your efforts and your presentations. And I just want to remind all of you, the presenters as well as the audience members, thank you for coming in today. Tomorrow will be the third and last day of our annual conference. And tomorrow's conference will be chaired by Professor Julie Mehta, who will be chairing it. And we have the whole conference is taking a slightly different approach from hard stuff to soft stuff. So tomorrow we are going into culture, literature, and sort of novels and the representations of art in the diaspora. So we have a scholar from who's studying at Oxford University. She will present. We have a scholar from China who has already sent her recorded material. And we have a standalone session on post-war Cambodia. So I welcome you all, invite you all to tomorrow's meeting. I'm sure you'll enjoy it because it will offer us a different perspective. So with that, I close tonight's meeting and thank you once again for everything. And I hope to see all of you tomorrow.